introduce Relina Bulchandani from Cisco, who's not only been a fantastic, well, will be a fantastic moderator for this panel, but it's been a really help having her as a co-chair and being involved with the planning for the event. Relina is global lead for the Cisco Internet Business Solutions Group Connected Real Estate Practice. She has a tremendous amount of experience focusing on using technologies and other systems for the real estate sector and increasing the efficiencies of the real estate sector. She also has a wonderful background in terms of being very connected to the real estate industry and real estate development, having worked at Forest City Ratner and also on the real estate consulting group of Ernst & Young. She's also a fellow Penn alum, which is always nice to see. There's a few in the room, so it's great to have. So Relina, please.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to take this opportunity as a co-chair to welcome you again today. We've kicked off the day fantastically. Really enjoyed the morning comments from Richard as well as the policy panel before us. And I was thinking through just the brilliant job Constantine's done of kind of curating today. We've got industry practitioners, we've got professionals, we've got an audience, and we're really kind of trying to connect the dots between the policy and some of the top-down thinking to how it's done, which we're going to spend a lot of time on today around technology, open data, real estate data, and then get into the afternoon around the investment side of things and translating some of this information to make sense and make it viable, essentially. So I think it's really interesting to see how the building blocks will come together. Before we get into our panel, the way we're going to structure my panel today is I'm quickly going to introduce each person on the panel, and they're going to introduce themselves with a little bit more detail. And then we're going to spend time going through some detailed questions. But I just want to level set a little bit. We've heard different things this morning. And statistics we already know out there in terms of buildings and energy consumption. We know worldwide it's over 50%. We heard this morning New York is over 75%. And we know our world is dramatically changing. And if you just think about devices, sensors, networks, back in, I don't want to lose people, so I'm quickly going to go through this. Back in 2004, we had 300 million devices on the internet. And now in 2013, we're expecting to have 1 trillion devices. So tremendous data, information, but 3 major trends are resulting from this. There's connection. We're hearing the number of different network sensors, devices. There is convergence. There's a lot of convergence going on in the industry also. And there's proliferation. So I just want you to keep this at the back of your mind as we're thinking through this. I think our panel, and especially what we're doing actually at the building level, is really interesting because there's a lot of talk now, especially globally. I have a global role, so I travel a lot to places like Songdo and India and China and look at these large-scale developments where Cisco as a company, IBM, other companies are really trying to connect the dots through the power of the network. Let's try and get a lot of different devices. Let's get transportation talking to real estate. But being a real estate practitioner at heart, I really think ultimately it does come down to spaces and buildings and really trying to capture that level at the granular level. So before we get into the panel, I just wanted to kind of lay some of our thinking in the space, and I'm quickly going to introduce the panelists, and they're going to introduce themselves after that. I'll start with John Gilbert, who's his Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, and Chief Technology Officer, a veteran in New York City for us, at Rudin Management. Go ahead, John.
Greetings. The Rudin family, and we're represented by Michael Rudin here, as a recent graduate of the NYU Masters in Real Estate program. We own and operate 15 million square feet in the city of New York, 10 million commercial, 5 million residential. It's all owned by the family. Our focus really is on looking at our properties from an infrastructure standpoint and trying to understand what we need to do as the building owner to enable our customers, our tenants, whether they're residential or commercial, to ultimately have the tools that they need to manage and measure their base and peak energy loads. And that's, we'll get into that a little bit later.
Our next panelist we have is Peter Miscovich, Managing Director of Corporate Solutions at Jones Lang LaSalle.
Relina, thank you. For those of you who don't know, Jones Lang LaSalle is a global real estate service provider. We're 40,000 people across the globe, 750 locations, and we oversee 1.8 billion square feet of commercial real estate. I lead our corporate strategy practice within Jones Lang LaSalle, based here in New York, focused on Fortune 100 companies, sustainable urbanization, innovation and emerging technologies. And very glad to be here today, Relina. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. We next have Joe Phillips, who's a director at IBM's Global Business Services, focusing on smarter buildings and smarter cities as well.
Yes, thank you, Relina. Hi, but for those of you who don't know IBM, we're a transformational company in many ways. And that's what my role is at IBM, is as taking this transformational offering of smarter buildings and smarter cities and starting to look at how do we create interoperable systems? How do we create intelligence out of the sea of data that we're surrounded by? Because the problem is no longer do we have data, the problem is we have too much data. And so part of our approach is to look at analytics and start to use interoperability so we can create the platform by which everybody can come and participate as we transform this industry called real estate and buildings.
Our next panelist is Chris Pyke, and Dr. Pyke is Vice President of Research for the U.S. Green Business Council.
So I'm familiar with IBM. It's the calculator people, right? Wait. So I'm Chris Pyke. I'm the Vice President for Research with the U.S. Green Building Council, and my purview is the breadth of what we understand to be green buildings. So that's transportation, accessibility, energy, materials, water, and so forth. And so the resource that I primarily have to work with is we are in the middle of changing the way that we understand, of mobilizing the data stream that is associated with certification in line with our market transformation mission. And so that is a natural evolution of what USGBC has done over the last decade, and I'm very honored to have the chance to work on that problem.
Our last panelist is Cody Taylor, who's an energy technology and policy specialist at US DOE.
Thank you. I won't introduce the DOE, but I work in the Building Technologies program there, and we have a number of efforts in this area around common data practices, metrics, algorithms, and data structures, and we see that as our role as the federal government, are helping people agree on how to define, store, track, exchange these kinds of data around building energy efficiency and building energy performance.
Excellent. Thanks, Cody. So just a quick carry on from our last panel. I'm going to quickly start off with just open this up to the panel. Given the current policy direction around energy disclosure laws, we heard them from a number of different people, what kind of information are you and your clients tracking, disclosing, and using to make effective business decisions? So what are also tenants and clients kind of requiring of you, almost demanding of you? And what technologies do you use to track and consolidate this information? Loaded question.
Just back on where we're trying to get to, which is really to focus on each sector, residential and commercial, and really focus on how do we enhance the livability standard of those properties. In the residential side, what we're trying to do, and our metaphor is to really look at our properties like an iPad. Equip it with enough infrastructure so that applications can be developed so that people can ultimately manage and measure their own electricity consumption. There's a building out the window here, 130 West 12th Street, which we think is the first building in the city of New York where in a multifamily situation, our customers at their option will be able to control all HVAC, all lighting over their iPad or their iPhone or their BlackBerry, wherever they are in the world. So if you're on your way to the airport and you forgot to turn the HVAC off, no problem, you can do that. You can monitor when your kids come home at night because the lights go on if you happen to be away. And the additional applications that will flow from that, whether it's wireless nanny cams and security, on, because we will have equipped that building with the infrastructure necessary to accomplish that. On the commercial side, a little bit more complicated, a lot more moving parts. I agree totally with Joe's premise that we don't have to, it's not about what data we collect, it's about what the heck we do with it. Our job ultimately as building owners is to take that data, remove the silos, and then turn that data back over to our customers ultimately so they can understand what their base and peak loads are. And how do you do that? Ultimately, you do that by upgrading your meters. You do that by obtaining the appropriate hardware and software. And then you ultimately You have to engage your tenants in a conversation to convince them that this is the right thing for them to do, and to begin to focus. Really what we're focused on first is base load. What can you do to decrease your base load? And then ultimately, from a peak load standpoint, what can you do to make your building, your companies more efficient and more productive?
Thank you, Chris. In terms of the technologies, what IBM is doing is looking at all of the existing sources of data. I mean, we have a way to think about this, which is intelligent, or I should say instrumented, interconnected, and intelligent. And by instrumented, we're looking at any source of data that's available from the building. So we're developing or have developed, an approach that takes information from the building management system. In fact, it takes information from all of them, and that's what we mean by interoperable. We can, from a portfolio viewpoint, we can start to connect all of the siloed building management systems, collect data from them so that you can get a portfolio view, but also drill all the way down to a variable frequency drives performance, and start to predict when a failure may occur based on either vibration or heat or any other parameter that you put into that particular asset. So in that, the data that we're actually using and finding the most valuable is the operational data. And by that, what we mean, we're trying to marry the performance of the physics of the building, of those various assets, to that necessary human system that will go out and fix what's broken when it breaks, or fix what's broken before it fails. Because as you'll hear, I'm sure, in other panels, and we heard a little bit earlier today, it's about risk. And if you're investing in an energy conservation project, we can all predict on the basis of engineering how that system will enhance the initial energy performance of the building, or of the portfolio, or of the entire set of investments that people have made. The question is, since the investment is time-based, how do you maintain that performance over time? And it's absolutely necessary that you marry the human system of facilities operations and engineering to that physical system. So we've developed a system that now collects operational information about work orders and work order management. So whenever that system is failing, it now creates an alert, which becomes an automated work order or a prioritized work order, which is more important, because your return on investment may not be money. It may be criticality of mission. So if you're running an operating room, or if you're running a military base, it may be some aspect of that operation that you need to have that component working for, and energy may not be the issue. So in that context, then you issue the work order and then immediately track that work order. That gives investors a level of transparency that allows them to understand, is my investment being looked at today? Am I above water or underwater because the facilities team is taking care of my building? So that's one of the key things that we're looking at in terms of what types of data and what types of technology we're using.
I mean, there are a lot of different answers to that question, but I'll build on actually what Joe was saying really briefly and say, for a lot of people, when they think about green building practice, they think of it as a new construction phenomenon. But one of the changes of the last 2 years, and actually for us, kind of reached a notable point last summer, that the marginal square foot of green building activity that we engage with is an existing building. And the bulk of that activity, so the marginal project is still a new construction project, probably overseas, but the marginal square foot is an existing building. And to echo what Joe was saying, these are portfolio management decisions, and increasingly the attention is turned to the portfolio. And if we take, for instance, the General Services Administration as a model, there are many others. We are talking increasingly and pretty narrowly on how do we manage the portfolio, how do we provide decision support, interoperability, automated workflows, how are we bringing data in a federated data space into an automated portfolio tracking, and how do we provide decision support back out, whether that's decision support in green cleaning or any energy efficiency, it's the same platform. And we see an increasing diversity of the people who are accelerating the flows of data on. So for instance, we're trying to accelerate, those linkages to portfolio manager are becoming automated, and the manual process is going to the side. And at the same time, on the back end, we're seeing basically what are the workflows we need to get this out to hundreds or thousands of users within a corporate environment and institutionalize it. That's the kind of moment we're at. There's a lot of other ways to answer that too, but I just would call that one out as notable.
Sure, and I can build on that as well. At the Department of Energy, also thinking about the sort of portfolio management space, and we've been working to create this National Buildings Performance Database that is a repository to aggregate building data nationally and really be a house for empirical data that can support actuarial analysis that can actually be used to determine risk profile of various energy efficiency upgrades in various building typologies. That is a specific type in a specific location, a specific size, age, any way you want to slice the real estate market. Actually give a home to vast quantities of empirical data about how that performs over time. So in a way that folks can start to query that and think through what are the portfolio risks or risk across a large portfolio of buildings of making particular types of upgrade investments. So that's something that we're trying to put together at the federal level to enable other people to use that in their decision making. And the one other thing I'll mention that's related is sort of enhancing and building out the space that Portfolio Manager has helped open up in building rating to complement what Portfolio Manager currently offers as a outcome rating of here's what the energy outcomes were in a building with an asset-based rating that helps you disentangle. There are various reasons for a particular outcome, and some of those have to do with occupancy, and some with operations, and some with the physical infrastructure itself. And so we are trying to build out this asset rating to help anyone who's thinking about evaluating buildings to have another tool out there to get a standardized view into what is the efficiency of this building's DNA, so to speak, the built-in systems, and how does that compare to another.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I want to hear from Peter from a corporate end-user perspective. Can you discuss kind of the importance of IT in driving demand for real estate and the role of buildings that are able to accommodate emerging technologies to respond to tenant needs? And I'd love John also to comment on that question.
Thank you, Relina. Well, this is a topic near and dear to my professional life. I've been involved in workplace efficiency for about 20 years. And to echo Rebecca Kraft's comments earlier from Con Edison, if we really look at demand and demand reduction from a tenant perspective, to give you a little historical guidance, in the 1980s and early 90s, we were about at 500 rentable per person in the United States from a per capita energy consumption and footprint consumption. By 2010, we're about 200 rentable per person, and with some of our clients, including Cisco and IBM, we're now moving from 200 rentable per person down to 50 rentable per person across their corporate portfolios. I think, from our CoreNet Workplace Consortium, which is, again, 1,500 companies, global Fortune 500, 100 companies, the average office space today is occupied 35 to 45% of the time. So it means on any given day, week, or month, office space occupancy is, barely 50%. So 50% of the energy use, the lighting, the water is often wasted through inefficient means. And so with new technologies, digital technologies, I'll give another example. With one client, we're eliminating all the printers and most of the paper in this organization. I haven't owned a printer since 2005. I haven't owned a car since 1995. My energy footprint is about a quarter of the average American because of my lifestyle in New York and because of my digital mobility behaviors as a knowledge worker. And I think, Relina, what we're beginning to experience is a convergence around digital transformation, the mobile internet, and a generational confluence. One of my favorite sayings is the baby boomers are the most wasteful generation in the history of mankind. And I'm hoping that the next generation can adopt these new technologies together with the convergence of these technologies that you described to really create a new era, a step change era in terms of energy efficiency and innovation. So my goal is to work with smart clients like Cisco and IBM in further reducing their energy consumption, their footprint consumption, place them in green buildings and green facilities that are managed well. And we could see 80% reduction in this country by 2020 if we were to leverage all of the convergence that I've just described. So I think it's a very exciting time. I agree with Joe. There's so much data. The question is, what do we do with it?
Absolutely.
How do we change behavior? And from our perspective, it's all about really facing the challenges and opportunities of demand first. So John, I'll let you.
Just on the macro level, I think one of the things we have to do is kind of change the vernacular. You know, every time I hear somebody stand up and say, well, 70% of all the energy in the city of New York is consumed by buildings, I'm saying, yeah, but that's only half the story. Because if all those buildings were vacant, it wouldn't be, you know, you wouldn't be consuming all the electrons and you know and foot-pounds of steam. I mean, it really is an energy policy that doesn't focus on the end user, the person who's got their foot on the pedal, will ultimately fail. And when we have to acknowledge that at the end of the day, and that's why we're focused on base load, because that base load is what's happening in your offices when no one's there. And ultimately identifying those things that are plugged in, and whether you call it phantom load or whatever you want to call it, shut that stuff off if you possibly can. And in order to do that, you need to give we need to give our customers and corporate America the tools that they can use to ultimately be able to see that on a daily basis. And there, you know, we break it down very simply. What's available for the single family user, and then take it to a multifamily situation. There's a great little device called the TED 5000. TED stands for the energy detective. You ultimately put this little clothespin, which is a little Wi-Fi radio, right where your meter comes into the house. That basically relays, you know, wireless data. You download free software from Google, and you ultimately can now see your peak and your base load. So how do you take that to a multifamily situation? Because my little wireless router on the 17th floor of my apartment is not going to touch that meter that's in the basement. So what does the owner have to do? The owner has to ultimately put in ubiquitous Wi-Fi, and that Wi-Fi has to be secure. You know, that to me, everybody says, well, it's all about the cloud. Well, how do you access the cloud? Well, the iCloud is Wi-Fi. So from our standpoint, we're really focused on creating ubiquitous Wi-Fi throughout our entire residential portfolio. Expensive? Yes. Valuable? We think so. We think that those applications will ultimately follow. But it's really, you know, another example is the Nest the Nest thermostat, which is a wonderful product that was created by a former Apple employee. And what that does, and this is a very important piece, it's actually a machine that learns. And what we're trying to do within our commercial portfolio is to create, using all this data that we've collected, all this BMS data and other sources of data, and try to focus on what, you know, the big data movement. Well, how do we drill down, use that data, identify those 8 or 10 key pieces of that data, and then teach that machine through software and middleware, ultimately, hey, today is exactly the same day as it was 2.5 years ago. What were your set points? What ultimately did you do that day? And ultimately, so that those machines can on their own figure out how to be intelligent and how to make decisions that will ultimately save energy. So I don't know if that was on point, but that's kind of where we're headed.
I think the whole adaptive learning of devices, we've made the point there's tremendous data available. And ultimately, we know it's making sense serving up that data, empowering be it citizens or corporate end users, tenants with that data is essential. So I think it was a really good point. I want to switch to Joe and Cody and Chris and get your opinion on some of the new, especially from you, Joe, some of the new and innovative optimization solutions for buildings and portfolios. Because from a Cisco perspective also, we're really looking at a portfolio-wide perspective versus just a building perspective. So.
Yes, and portfolios are the key because we're in a transformation time. where it's no longer the silos of an individual building, or even worse, the silos of the mechanical system, the electrical system, the voice data system, and the FF&E. It's now a portfolio of data that you're getting. And what we're trying to do is take that data through analytics that are really the special sauce that's associated with this. And by analytics, we're talking about historical use. We're talking about analytics that bring in data from externalities, such as what's the weather today, and can I shut down my chillers because I can use free cooling, to those sort of information sources that give us the ability to enable good decisions by the facilities team. So from a portfolio example, what IBM is doing in this, and when I say doing it, I really mean doing it, we've adopted this technology, and IBM is a numbers-driven company. We're predicated on shareholder value at our core. And so we're not going to adopt something or use this if it's not generating shareholder value. And in this case, expense reduction in our real estate holdings, which are about 100 million square feet around the world. And in this, we started our Rochester, Minnesota site with just a couple of air handling units and have expanded that now to what are 10 sites in the U.S., and we've got another 20 sites planned for 2012 to roll out this approach, which basically looks at the performance data from any IP addressable component and starts to understand what's going on in real time. And that's the important characteristic here, because what we're doing is trying to shift the paradigm with this data from, in a portfolio way, from retro commissioning to real-time commissioning. We all know that if you fix what's broken when it's broken, you're going to save a lot more energy. But if you do retro commissioning and it's scheduled for 6 months from now, it may be out of spec for 5.5 months of those 6. So how do you bring this into real-time performance? And what that does is shift the entire approach, the entire paradigm of facilities operations and maintenance from a preventive maintenance approach to condition-based maintenance. Because in preventive maintenance, you may be spending 2 or 3 days a week looking at things that aren't broken. Well, that's a waste of facility operations. And so what we've been able to see over time in this shift is not just a savings of energy, which we've got in IBM, which is, you know, an award-winning company in terms of our real estate and site operations group's ability to manage, because everybody's got a number at IBM, and they've got a number which is reduce energy, which they've been doing year after year after year since 1994. And in that context, they were resistive because they said, look, we're already doing all the physics stuff. We're already doing the smart engineering. And we came in and said, well, we're actually not teaching you new engineering practices. We're giving you a new layer of visibility, a new diagnostic tool, new analytics that lets you see deeper in real time than what you've been seeing before. The energy savings have been about 12% in that well-managed company. In other places, like Tulane University, where we have an installation, our energy savings in that type of approach have been 38% over their traditional load. So it's real, it's real-time data, and it's real savings. And we think from a portfolio standpoint, as places like Tulane roll this out across their portfolio, they're going to be able to use this technology to put cash flow back into their institution, back into their mission, which is ultimately what this is about as we transform this industry.
Build just really briefly on one thing, that just take this in 2 different directions and try to partition 2 issues that are here. I think I completely agree with this idea that John and Joe have talked about saying we're going to bake more intelligence into this. Because one thing that we haven't done as an industry, certainly in the FM context, is use machine learning, use that kind of machine learning styles that have characterized big data in other industries. I mean, if you take and compare, if you use the example of, say, credit cards as an example, and the relationship between a singular FICO score that is an aggregate of a vast amount of information that ultimately gets down to a single transaction you had at Starbucks at some moment and cascades upwards and downwards. The only way you play at the bottom of that is machine learning and some sort of artificial intelligence and rules. And that is an empirical driven thing, and we're behind in that. And companies like IBM and others are leading that charge. I think there's a complementary dimension, which is essentially a social learning dimension that says, all right, we have a bunch of rules, but the breakthroughs may not lend themselves all the time to machine learning. What is that guy over there in that building who is overperforming all the others doing, or that gal over there, and trying to make it so that you can unlock the what are others like me doing. And basically that's a social learning phenomenon. And if we take it to its endpoint, that's the difference between conventional Google and a Facebook-style data acquisition. And they're perfectly complementary to each other. And so the question is, if we look out in the future, this sort of 5 years out, 10 years out, we're going to look at reconciling those two ways of knowing and deploying them across the enterprise.
So I think, we're hearing a lot about there's this flood of data out there, and there's more than we know what to do with, and if we could only figure out how to use it right, we can manage all of our buildings so much better. And I think that's true. That's quite true in the top tier of buildings and in the locations where the real estate is valuable enough to warrant the installation of sensing and metering equipment and building management systems that cost real money. And so our view at the Department of Energy is that stuff costs more than it needs to. And so one of our initiatives in the buildings program is actually a bunch on the R&D side for lowering the cost of sensors and controls, because we think there are real opportunities there to actually penetrate the rest of the market, not just the cream here in New York City. And so that's one side that I think I wouldn't underestimate the portion of the building stock that does not yet really financially have access to that kind of data at a price point that they can deal with. And the other side is at the portfolio level. Now, I mentioned the National Buildings Performance Database that we've created and are starting to work with folks on. And that, I think, is, again, something that large building portfolio owners have some visibility into essentially a risk distribution on how something performs across a range of assets. If they can do something in a bunch of buildings and see the answer is not always X, it looks like this. And many of the smaller building owners around the country don't have that luxury of that kind of insight into what the performance risk is of any particular energy efficiency upgrade to their building. And so we think that this National Buildings Performance Database is something that can open that kind of access up to some of the smaller building owners and also to other service delivery channels, whether that's an insurance product that someone now has enough intuition and insight into what the risks are of particular types of energy efficiency investments that they can offer an insurance product that covers a whole swath of buildings, or whether it's directly for investors in large numbers of buildings. But we think that at the portfolio level, that's the way to think about it in terms of unlocking some other investment opportunities there that are currently seen as too risky because we don't know what the risk profile is. And there's a limited trust of just single number engineering models as the right way to get to the bottom of that. So we think that empirical data can actually be part of the answer.
Cody, I want to piggyback on an idea you touched upon, this concept of the digital divide. Essentially, you have the leaders and the laggards, kind of the gorillas and the gazelles. Thoughts from the panel in terms of bridging it, and just your general thoughts around this digital divide, which we believe is growing.
I'll certainly jump in on that. I think that I wanted to echo what Cody said, is it's saying the view from, I think this is one of the places where the view from New York or the view from the Fortune 500 may not be representative of the majority of practice in the US, and it's certainly a richer and more nuanced story around the world. And that's one of the things we've seen in green building, and we've always had this notion that we would stretch the market, that basically we would increase the gap between the head and the tail. And I don't know if it's happening faster than we thought it was, but when we were drawing charts 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, showing how we thought we were going to stretch that market. And that's exactly what's happening. And we are having to deal with incredible sophistication at the top of the market, and in the mid-market and bottom of the market, they're barely on the train. And so trying to deal with the push and the pull, and trying to think about it as, what are the tools we can use for that? How can we accelerate the diffusion of innovation? How can we bring it down market? Is it a cost? Is it education? Is it all of these different things? And that situation gets acutely more complicated when we go into the international context, where we're active right now in about 127 countries and that are doing some form of green building that we see through our data stream. And what, for instance, just one piece of that is saying we're in sophisticated markets. We want to be in automated, trusting relationships between data providers. In other countries around the world, people are looking to us to be the trusted arbiter of what actually is data. and so the idea that it is a digital data stream is down the road. The idea that someone, a third party, is checking your work is a huge value proposition, and the digitalization of that communication is a number of years down the road. And so I just wanted to underscore that is a major feature of the market that we see, and it is a critical feature in the international conversation.
Thank you.
Relina, I'd like to comment on that from a corporate perspective. The digital divide is increasing between those who are successful in energy efficiency, and I would name Procter & Gamble, Cisco, IBM, our clients at AT&T, and then the remainder are falling further and further behind. And what's fascinating about that, we're a member of the Investor Network on Climate Risk, which is a $12 trillion investment group of institutional investors. And what's really interesting is that the investment and profitability of those leaders is continually gaining. And so if the markets are, shall we say, an enabler, perhaps the leaders, there'll be bigger winners who will be far ahead and many more losers in terms of corporate performance, energy performance. And I'd like to say, by 2020 or 2015, we'll start linking corporate financial performance with energy efficiency and energy performance. And low carbon companies will be great investments, and sustainable capitalism may be our ecosystem versus the current ecosystem, which I don't really know how to describe it other than fragmented and disorganized. So I think the digital divide that Cody mentions is true not only in terms of portfolios and buildings, but also in corporate entities and corporate performance.
There's a comment I'd like to follow up on with that, and I love your points about the divide and what's happening with the various companies. And I look at it from the perspective of what lessons can we drive into the marketplace? How can we help people learn from these processes, and what does success look like? Because I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have right now, is that we're trying to train a new generation of building owners and building operators to understand what does that new digital world look like. So one of our implementations is actually, that I'm very excited about, is at Tulane University. And it's not for the energy savings and all of that, that's all great. But Tulane is using the installation, actually initiated the conversation about can we go first, from their School of Architecture. Because Ken Schwartz, the Dean of the School of Architecture, basically looks at it this way. He's educating the next generation of building professionals that have to make decisions based on not just context and history and space and understanding the characteristics of brick and stone and steel and form. They have to understand technology. They have to be able to understand how that composition that they're making performs, how they can collect more data to see how it influences what they're doing. And so in that context, there's a lot of work to be done, as you indicated, from the theory to using something like BIM in its true capacity to be able to put all the attributes in so that a designer can have at a moment's notice an indicator that my carbon footprint has changed because I changed the design this way, and make decisions based on data feedback to them that's not based in simple past historical practices, but start to get real-time feedback into that decision-making process that creates the next generation of building stock.
I think it's really connected to the transparency discussion from the panel earlier in the day about if these policies that New York City is putting into place and Philadelphia is considering others have going, that's the way that you, again, start to bring this mid-market and down-market, because you've got the upper echelon of buildings who have the ability and interest and wherewithal to go after LEED certification or to bring their building performance up to a level that they can actually get the Energy Star for their building and things like that. So we have had the ability to indicate high performance but there have not really been mechanisms out there for buildings mid-market and down-market to say, I'm better than my neighbor. Because if I'm a small building owner, I don't need to be better than the Empire State Building. I need to be better than the small building next door if I'm looking for my target types of tenants. And so I think that there really is a role for those sorts of policies to play, and we shouldn't underestimate the title of this panel as open data, the value of bringing that data into the market in ways that people can then act on because they can actually show some results and show some results of their investments in energy efficiency in ways that can be valuable to tenants and other types of customers.
So I just want to really quickly follow up on one thing Cody said, because I think it is a really interesting tie to the first panel. Because the issue is saying, if I agree with a lot of that, at the same time I also wonder, how do we use information to make the pursuit of these goals more aspirational? Like the idea that you're going to bring the lower part of the market kind of in almost a regulatory, bring them in, we're going to disclose about them, and we're going to try to engage them that way, is important. But there's another dimension to it, which is how do you make high performance yet more desirable? And I think Mark called it being hip or whatever it is. But it's not just that. I mean, we don't carry an iPhone because someone told us to. It solves problems in our life that is worth the money. And I think that in this context, and you don't get to 100% market share. Even Steve Jobs doesn't get to 100% market share, but you do move the market. And I think that we have to find a way to yin and yang the notion of bringing this competitive floor while still making success solving problems. I know we've seen that with the smart grid, right? We've seen a smart grid that was good for utilities, yet maybe didn't put enough emphasis on what it could do for a homeowner. And so asking what problems are we solving with our technology that are desirable to have, that are value creating, and it's a yin and a yang, it's a both. So, and just to mention that.
I'm going to go out on a limb and make a very profound statement that may shock some of you, but building owners are not rocket scientists. But what they are entrepreneurs. And I think and let's also understand what moves a property owner. Vacant space. So if we can really begin to look at these issues and turn them around, the smart grid was exactly the right analogy, because that was just a play by the utilities, and I apologize to my friends at Con Edison in the room here today, but that was basically a play by the utilities to say, how do we, what's in it for us? Nothing wrong with that. But from a customer standpoint, you had to understand that the real issue here was introducing Robert Metcalfe, the creator of Ethernet, to Nikola Tesla, the creator of alternating current, and merging those two worlds so that everything that we learned in IT, we can now apply to energy management and energy technology. Because those two worlds have to merge. That handshake has to occur. And if people are focused on that and focused on the customer and really understanding that what we're all in business to do is to sell, in our case to rent, and that we got to get in the heads of those customers to really understand what they want and to deliver that product that they want, then that's all good. And that others will catch up. Others, when they get vacant space, will see, well, geez, what did Rudin do? What did Durst do? What did the Fisher brothers do? How did they land that tenant? And those best practices will come out in forums like this, where people who are willing to talk about what they're doing and share their experiences will do so. And smart people sitting in the audience will say, hey, I like that idea. I'm going to go follow that trail and see where it leads me, and maybe find more things along that trail than the person speaking did. But we've got to start someplace, and I think thinking about the customer, thinking about the consumer, thinking about the person with their foot on the pedal, and getting inside their head and giving them the tools that they need is the right way to go.
Any other comments before I take this down a different direction? So I want to kind of piggyback on what you were just talking about in terms of disseminating the information. So we've talked a lot about tracking, analyzing. Let's talk a little bit about communicating and disseminating this information for the various stakeholders involved. Often it's tenants, it's investors, lenders, owners, building managers, IT folks. So really getting kind of the north side, south side, even in the building context, to start talking to each other. So thoughts around how do we really empower users with this information for their different uses?
Okay, I'm going to take an initial shot at that because that's really at the key. If it doesn't drive action, it doesn't matter. If it doesn't drive change, you know, we're in a transitional phase, and there's an old way of doing things, and we're trying to go to a new way, and that's what the heart of your organization has done, which is said, take the old practices and throw them out, and let's start with some new ones, because that's the only way we're going to change what we're doing. And you know, Rumi, as a poet, described, he said, between ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And that field is information. That field is data. And so the ability to create dashboards that let people see what they need to see, when they need to see it, based on their role and their need, is absolutely essential in this process. And so as a big data company, one of the things we're focused on is being able to categorize the data by what's the role that individual plays. Is it the corporate executive and they need a strategic view of energy performance across the portfolio? Are they the facility manager and engineer? Do they need to see what's going on in an individual building or an individual air handling unit? Or is it a technician that says, while I'm out fixing something that just broke, I know that it's under warranty and I need to be where I need to be to fix something else so that I don't have to roll my truck out there at another time. And so that sort of dissemination of information is based on what their needs are, and you really have to start at that level, is to understand what are all, and create this incredible matrix of what are the roles and activities that each of those play within that. And it's really based on, you know, breaking down the, you know, the old story testament of the Tower of Babel, which is where we started in this process of silos, and realizing that if we don't start to bridge those gaps and create information that others can use that I may own. We were talking earlier before the panel started, and we said, you know, the model has been changed by Google and the internet, which is it's not about who holds the information that wins, it's about who gives the information away faster, and who makes it more accessible and who makes it available. So to echo one thing that I think is really important about some of the comments earlier about learning and driving the information out to, you know, to use the term the have-nots in this, is that sort of policy enforcement capability. Because it's interesting, if you read all the detailed executive orders and many of the policies, there's 3 magic words inside those policies that we can bring lessons to bear based on property owners and the financial metrics, which is if cost effective. And if you read all the fine print in there, that phrase is always in these drivers. It said the agency must do this if cost effective. So if we can create the business case around energy, if we can create the verification that financial lenders want to see to reduce their risk, if we can create the transparency of those groups to be able to see what is going on in their buildings in real time, then you have made the cost-effective case, and then others will follow. They don't have to build that individual case for themselves. It will now become a practice. And that's really what we're trying to drive as new practices. We don't want every building owner to go through this fancy ROI calculation, either on net present value or total life cycle cost. We just want them to do something different, because that's the only way you get a different result.
Peter?
You know, I just have one comment to Relina's question and to Joe's comments. We're seeing a perfect storm of convergence around big data, advanced analytics, cloud, virtualization, and low-cost sensors. And, you know, I was going to use IBM as actually my case study in terms of continuous improvement in this area. But in about 5 years, I think, Relina, will have the tools and capabilities and vast sums of data at a very low price point to be much more effective than we are today. And our leading clients, you know, Cisco, IBM, others, are already starting to do that. We just need to bring that at scale. And as the cost incrementally decreases, I think the scale will increase from a demand perspective, and building owners then will be more engaged and motivated to invest and make this happen at scale. So final concluding remark.
Yeah, I think I'll just add one quick thing to that. I think that the real defining issue of the next era of this is relevance. Is the issue of going, for our team, for instance, we have pretty much gone 50-50 on design and IT programming right now. And I think the ratio as we go forward of design and user experience and so forth is just going to keep going up. Because I think about it, and I think about it some days with our team, and I go, what you take something like something we love to hate, like the freaking check engine light on your car. Like, I mean, think about the amount of information content boiled down into a ridiculous check engine light, which, I mean, and we call it the idiot light or whatever, but some days that's all you really want to know. Is my car broken? And let's not go to the point of whether or not it really means it's broken or just whatever, but the issue is that's all I really want to know. I don't want to know all the rest of it. And I find that the search for relevance and salience and condensing and audience specific is so much harder than we have historically, and has so much upside and will become the focal point.
Okay, I think I'm going to move into my last question. You've kind of touched upon it, but being the eternal optimist that I am, I'm going to project ourselves into the future and assume we're now attending the same conference in 2020. So the Better Buildings Data Challenge is in place. And my question to the panel, last comments, is what changes will have taken place? And you've kind of touched upon this, but if you could just wrap this up in your leaving remarks, what changes will have taken place in the past 10 years that have made, actually 8 years, that would have made a significant difference in open data and the role of information technology in creating sustainable infrastructure?
So my pitch on that is that it's open data standards, so that information exchange can actually happen in a way that folks can aggregate data up, use my data with your data, and that by using open standards, that's the way we can unlock innovation in this area. As Joe was mentioning, we're transitioning from a place of proprietary systems and proprietary data standards for each sensor manufacturer's systems and things like that to a place where either operational data within the building in real time or whole building, more periodic data can be out there, and we should ensure that it's out there in ways that the structures and standards are open, because that's what lets multiple minds work on the problem to actually try to innovate some way to make that data relevant and useful to people who need it at the time that they need it in the way that speaks to them.
So I'll take that in a slightly different way. I think that 10 years out, I think what I would love to see is I think we are well along in the idea of we have this fire hose of energy data. I think 10 years out, we're going to match that fire hose of energy data with experiential information from people in these spaces, whether it's distributed sensors like we talked about, the ones we're carrying, or social media based or whatever it is. But we're going to recognize that pendulum is shifted, is imbalanced at the current time because of the ease with which we can collect energy data, and we're going to restore that to parity, and we're going to get back to the fundamental creators of value in real estate, which is the way people experience the space, and we'll get back to balance with that. And at the same time, we're going to have a much richer way of understanding the way that we experience outdoor, the way that having maps on our phones with a little GPS dot that follows us around is the way that we experience the outside world. I believe in 10 years that's going to be comfortably ensconced in the way that we understand indoor spaces as well, and it's going to bring that experience in. And so I think that's pretty, I'd bet on that. Maybe not $10,000 bucks, but I'd bet on that.
Yeah, be careful on that one. I think because we will have enabled our buildings to collect data, and we will have more and more refined performance metrics and behavior modification and all of that, it'll be sort of standard in that approach. And I think the next conference at that time will be about how do we use that technology now to actually drive the performance of people in buildings. So it comes back to why we build buildings in the first place, which is they're there to support the enterprise that we built them for. They're there to support people in their residences, or whether they're a research scientist, whether they make them productive or safe, whatever it is. We're going to be using that data and gathering in that way that actually drives the higher performance of people and the mission of organizations.
I'll just conclude with perhaps a political remark, but I'll go there. I hope we're able to transform and transition systematically to a low-carbon economy based upon sustainable capitalism. And buildings and corporations and infrastructure has a huge role to play in that transformation.
One thing I hope that doesn't change 10 years from now is that one of the panelists will also at that time be quoting Rumi. One of my favorite poets of all time. If you don't know about Rumi, he lived in Afghanistan in the 13th century. And for the guys out there, if around Valentine's Day, if you Google Rumi's love poems, there's some really, really good stuff. I think 10 years from now, what we're going to see is LED lighting that will be throughout much of our public space, and the fact that the ballast of that lighting will be replaced by a chip will enable enormous things to happen, because that chip will be able to be that remote sensor that will be able to be programmed to collect an enormous amount of data. I also think that our machines, our HVAC systems, our mechanical systems, our pumps throughout our buildings will be intelligent, and there will be hardware and middleware that ultimately will exist that will allow those machines to predict what they should be doing that day in a very, very efficient way. And I also think that somewhere in the universe, Robert Metcalfe will be sitting between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, and they will be looking down on us all saying, they actually did listen, and they actually did figure out what they had to figure out by merging these two systems.
Excellent. I think we're going to open it up to, we have about 5 minutes for questions from the audience.
Peter, could you just repeat the 5 things that you said are going to converge or are converging?
Pardon me, repeat the 5 things I said.
You mentioned 5 platforms that were converging at this time. Could you just repeat them a little bit slower?
Sure.
And a little bit more meat on the bone?
Big data, which Joe elaborated on, huge voluminous amounts of data. Cloud computing, the opportunity to aggregate, centralize, and analyze that data with virtualization, which is a lower cost means of computing. Advanced analytics, to take big data within a cloud, perform detailed analysis. Pervasive low-cost wireless, which will allow for very low-cost sensors, millions of sensors in a building, to all be connected simultaneously, reporting that data into the cloud, creating the big data platform that then can be analyzed. And from a corporate perspective, you know, IBM measures 100 million square feet in 15-minute increments globally, every 24 hours, in terms of data, energy management, where people are housed. And with locational sensors and next-generation GPS, I mean, the interrelationship of these converging technologies at a very low cost in about 5 years, you know, my view is will transform the real estate industry. And it's part of our digital transformation hope and dream.
Question?
Hello, I'm very much enjoying everybody's, the panels and everything. I think in 10 years' time, it's going to be wonderful with all this automation and everything. But I have to keep coming back to the same thing over and over again. No matter how much we automate everything, we still have to come back to the human aspect of it, and we can train people, we can try and persuade them, but at the end of the day, I haven't really heard enough about how, other than automating everything, how we can actually have the human side of things, and how people are going to actually interact with all of these things other than it just being automated. I'd like to just see if anybody has any further light to show on that. Thank you.
Just a quick story on that, which is it's a learning process, and we learn different practices along the way, and you only learn that through awareness. The U.S. Green Building Council has been, you know, the absolute leader in creating a new awareness around green buildings, and in that context, the experience that I can relay to that is the behavioral change that's occurred within our own facility management teams and others that we've seen with customers, is once they have these tools, these new visibility, a new awareness of what's actually going on. Again, it's a new layer of information. It's like buying your child a set of Legos and they dump them out on the table, and the first thing they do is build what's on the box. They follow the directions. And about 2 hours later, they're bored to tears and they're starting to create their own things, and you're just amazed at what they discover and create. And that is the learning process. That's a creative process of taking these tools where they will be, and that's solely a human element. The tools are just an enablement to that. It's a new enablement. We're all excited about the gizmos that we're creating, but it is really for the purpose of driving behavioral change. And you're right, it is the holy grail in all of this.
And I think what it allows us to do is to change our view from a look back to a what's happening right now. And the comments that were made in terms of preventive maintenance, in terms of real time knowing what's going on, and being able to use both wired and wireless networks to ultimately then communicate that data to the people who need to fix it, that's huge behavioral opportunities for change, huge. And the other thing I think that's important is what it also does is when you really take a building and or a portfolio and you begin, well, let's use the building as an example, and you begin to create competition within that building so that now that everybody has that pulse meter, everybody has that dashboard, everybody has the opportunity to see what their peak and base load, now the question is, well, what did you do with that data? Were you better or worse than the company above you or below you? And then how creative can building owners get ultimately to create that competition so that you've got this, everybody's looking at what everybody else has done, and you get the red star, the flat screen, or whatever the we won't hand out SUVs obviously as prizes, but somebody wins, and that's a good thing.
I'd just like to mention I serve on the board of the Garrison Institute, and we just had our 4th Climate, Mind, and Behavior conference last week, where I was a presenter. I have about 2 gigabytes of research information that supports human behavioral change. Because I couldn't agree with your comment more, that the technology will be there, the data will be there, and the National Environmental Education Foundation is another great resource, and they're working with school-age children, K through 12 educational programs. It's an education and behavioral challenge as much or more so than a technology challenge. And if you give me your card or anybody here, I'm happy to share with you in an open data format all of the research from both resources.
The idea that information makes buildings more efficient is very persuasive, very seductive, but it's still a hypothesis. The data so far doesn't clearly show that our highest technology buildings consistently outperform lower technology buildings on the other end of the digital divide. And I think this is part of what we're getting at with the human behavior issue. So I would just like to ask the panel perhaps to comment on where their certainty and confidence comes from in this hypothesis. Shouldn't this be a research program rather than an assumption?
It's a great notion, and I can give you a real-life example. Our most efficient building has the lowest Energy Star rating. Why? It's because what is the company inside that building doing? They've got trading floors, and they've got TV studios and radio studios. They burn a lot of electrons. So to me, it argues, are the metrics that we're using to measure efficiency the right metrics? And how can, it's not how can, it exists, it's a real example that our most efficient building will never ever become a LEED EB because we can't pierce the Energy Star. So what does that tell you? Maybe Green Buildings Council's got to come up with a new way to measure this. But to me, I think at the end of the day, if you don't spend the money and do the research and give your customers the opportunity to control their foot on the pedal, then we're all headed to a really bad place. So I accept the premise, even having lived what you've just described, which is something that's very, very frustrating to all of us inside Rudin, in that, you know, how can your most efficient building not have the lowest Energy Star rating?
Yeah. And two things very quickly on that, which is that there's a difference between a high-tech building and a high-performance building. And the technology without human intervention will degrade, period. It's law of energy and matter. You know, you have to keep putting energy into the system, which is human performance that actually tunes that building to operate. You know, a great analogy of that is a Formula One racer. You know, it's made to go around a track with as few pit stops as possible, but whenever they stop, they're stopping only for a reason that they've been told to fix to keep that high performance, even though it's, you know, relatively straightforward technology. And the actual confidence that comes around there is the fact that we have seen a difference between the buildings that are relatively high-tech buildings, whenever they're married up with a system that delivers the ability to have human performance interact with them, we have measurably significant better results out of them. So there's real numbers behind this. There are case studies. We can point you to places on the web to look at that are saying, you know, it's not just the technology, because the technology is a plateau. It's the human part of it that makes it happen. And that's really what we're talking about, is IT as that enabling tool. IT by itself doesn't do anything.
You know, I would just add one comment to that. I think we have overpowered, overlit, and over-engineered a majority of our buildings. Right. And older buildings that are based upon wireless networks, infrastructures perhaps that are less energy intensive, could be very low-cost retrofit solutions at a very low energy threshold. I mean, 8 watts per square foot is just ridiculous in my view in terms of an average. And we're working with clients right now on a 1.5 watt per square foot capability with tremendous technology connectivity. So I think we're in a very messy transition zone between the old technology and the emerging technologies, and how those will layer, if you will, into the existing building stock.
I think I'd add one thing to that. I think my personal feeling is that we're also in another transition, which is the idea, just narrowly on the focus of green buildings. We say we have a decade of understanding green building as an endpoint, but we would be well served to understand green buildings in an adaptive management framework. For instance, taking a page from our ecological colleagues and understanding that a green building is a set of hypotheses about what we think the outcomes are going to be, something that we're going to manage for continuous improvement over time. And that's a transition in mindset between what green building as outcome and green building as hypothesis that you're going to live through time is another transition that we're in right now.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to wrap up. We're running out of time. I want to thank the panel for our lively discussion today.